That's a valid concern about affordability. I'd like to add that VR technologies can also help bridge the gap in terms of access to quality educational resources. For instance, virtual labs can enable students in remote areas to conduct experiments and investigations that might not be possible in a traditional classroom setting. What are your thoughts on this?
Building on that idea, I'd say that VR technologies can also facilitate collaboration and social learning, which are essential for students' overall development. By working together in virtual environments, students from remote areas can connect with their peers from other parts of the world, fostering cultural exchange and global understanding. Does anyone feel differently?
That's a very good point about cultural exchange. I'd like to add that VR technologies can also provide an immersive and interactive way to learn about different cultures, histories, and environments. For example, students can take virtual tour of museums, historical landmarks, or natural wonders, making learning more engaging and accessible. What are your thoughts on this?
Referring back to the idea of immersive learning, I'd argue that VR technologies can also help address the issue of limited resources in remote areas. By providing access to virtual resources and facilities, students can gain hands-on experience and practical skills that might be difficult to acquire otherwise. How do you think this can impact student outcomes?
That's a very good point about addressing limited resources. I'd like to add that VR technologies can also help level the playing field in terms of assessment and evaluation. For instance, virtual simulations can provide a standardized and objective way to evaluate student performance, reducing biases and inconsistencies that may arise from human evaluation. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's a great point about standardized assessment. Building on that idea, I'd argue that VR technologies can also facilitate teacher training and professional development in remote areas. For example, virtual workshops and coaching sessions can help teachers in remote areas access high quality training and support, which might not be available otherwise. How do you guys feel about the potential of VR to support teacher development?
That's a very good point about teacher development. I'd like to add that VR technologies can also help foster a sense of community and connection among students in remote areas. By enabling them to interact with peers and teachers in virtual environments, VR can help alleviate feelings of isolation and disconnection that can come with remote learning. Yes, I completely agree that VR has the potential to make a positive impact on student outcomes.
Referring back to my earlier point about immersive learning, I'd like to add that VR technologies can also provide a safe and controlled environment for students to practice and develop essential skills, such as laboratory experiments or medical procedures. This can be particularly beneficial for students in remote areas who may not have access to well-equipped laboratories or experienced instructors. That's something I completely agree with, and I think it's an area worth exploring further.
To add to what was mentioned earlier about immersive learning, I'd argue that VR technologies can also help address the issue of accessibility in education. For instance, students with disabilities can benefit from VR experiences that are tailored to their needs, providing equal opportunities for learning and participation. That's a very good point, and I think it's essential to consider the potential of VR to promote inclusivity in education.
Building on that idea, I'd say that VR technologies can also facilitate more effective feedback and assessment in education. By providing a virtual environment for students to practice and demonstrate their skills, teachers can offer more accurate and constructive feedback, which can be particularly valuable for students in remote areas who may not have access to regular in-person feedback.
That's a very good point about effective feedback. I'd like to add that VR technologies can also help bridge the gap between theoretical and practical knowledge. With VR, students can gain hands-on experience and practice complex procedures in a low-risk environment, which can be especially beneficial in fields like healthcare, engineering, or scientific research. How does that relate to your thoughts on the topic?
Referring back to my earlier point about bridging the gap between theoretical and practical knowledge, I'd argue that VR technologies can also help increase student engagement and motivation. By providing an immersive and interactive learning experience, VR can make complex concepts more enjoyable and accessible, which can lead to increased student participation and better learning outcomes. That's something I completely agree with, and I think it's an area worth exploring further.
I think that's a very good point about student engagement and motivation. Building on that idea, I'd argue that VR technologies can also help foster a sense of presence and community in remote learning environments. By enabling students to interact with each other and their instructors in virtual spaces, VR can help create a more collaborative and supportive learning environment, which can be particularly beneficial for students who may be isolated or disconnected from their peers.
That's a very good point about community and collaboration. I'd like to add that VR technologies can also provide a platform for students to showcase their work and share their experiences with others. For instance, virtual exhibitions or presentations can allow students to display their projects and receive feedback from peers and instructors, which can help build their confidence and motivation. To add to what I mentioned earlier, I think it's essential to consider the potential of VR to support student-centered learning approaches. By providing a flexible and interactive learning environment, VR can enable students to take ownership of their learning and explore topics at their own pace, which can be particularly beneficial for students in remote areas who may have limited access to resources and support.
As we wrap up our discussion, it's clear that VR has the potential to revolutionize education, especially for students in remote areas. By providing immersive and interactive learning experiences, VR can increase engagement, motivation, and access to quality education. I think we've had a great conversation.
The potential of VR to revolutionize education is undeniable, and its benefits for remote students are substantial. I appreciate the insights shared, highlighting VR's ability to enhance engagement, motivation, and access to quality education, ultimately bridging the educational gap.
Reflecting on our discussion, VR's role in modern education seems promising, especially for remote areas. I appreciate the collaborative insights shared, showcasing VR's potential to boost engagement and bridge educational gaps. Let's continue exploring VR's possibilities in education.
Our conversation highlights VR's